Hey, good morning, Agnes.
Hey, how are you?
Doing good. Just it's like I have to update Zoom, and once I update Zoom, it doesn't let me use the meeting without a password. And this is uh, this is part of the new normal. Is that establishing security and trust over the internet at scale is a hard problem, and it is amazing that we are actually managing to pull that off as a society.
I mean, we kind of, on the one hand, we design our circumstances and then we try to adapt to our circumstances. So we design the things around us and then we design ourselves to accommodate those.
Yes. What is that? First, you design the system, and then the system designs you.
Yes, and again, not everyone is designing the system. So there are some of us that are designing the system, and there are some of us that are then trying to accommodate the new system, and then they try to give the feedback, which is again a good insight for the designers. And this is how we try to improve all together.
Right. Of course, then there's some of us who decide the system is not working and try and destroy it or replace it.
Oh, we have everyone.
Which is a great segue into our discussion of quantified communities. So this was the original phrase that you used during some online conference that caught my attention, that inspired me to reach out to you on LinkedIn. And so I've looked through the paper, and we will talk about that, but I'm actually more interested in the backstory. Like, how did you come up with the concept of quantified communities, and where are you hoping it will go?
All right. So if the question is, what is quantified communities and how it all started and where it all emerged?
Yeah.
So then we need to look back 4 years or even 5 years. And around that time and a little bit earlier, people were very actively speaking about quantified self. So the
Mhm.
first glimpse of how technologies can quantify our behaviors and actually measure and track and then give interesting feedback on how the things are around us. And while that was taking off, I was working at Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a postdoctoral associate at the Media Lab, and I was designing urban innovations to help people change towards their well-being. And while seeing this takeoff of the quantified self, but my attention was always about the societal scale. So how we can help larger groups of people to move towards their flourishing. I was thinking, well, if this is really something that is now called as a quantifying, I'm doing exactly that. I'm just doing it at a larger scale. And then instead of quantified self, it's quantified communities. And was the origin of that.
Great. And then maybe this is a good point to segue into the paper you wrote, and just kind of give a little 5-minute summary of uh, how that worked out.
Indeed. And then thinking about quantified communities, I was also working on scientific ways to enable design of these technologies for the urban space to actually help the people change and help the societies to transform. And then I was pulling together scientific insights and technology design, user interaction interface design insights with one aim is how we can scale up, how we can scale up the change and transformation towards well-being. And in that paper that I wrote during my MIT time was all about three major things that I contributed specifically in that paper. Number one, defining transformation, or in other words, defining sustainable change. So sometimes people just say, oh, we need to live better, but then they don't have any particular aspect of that. And that the whole discussion becomes very foggy and fuzzy. And therefore, I realized to give the first tool in the hands of scientists and practitioners was how to define it. And then I distinguished three types of change. And I also gave the basic tool for defining transformation, which predominantly have 6 elements. But the first one is, which is exactly your target group? then what these people are currently doing, which is possibly against their own well-being. And the next thing is what you would like them to do instead in the future. And that's the basic way to start the conversation about a certain change. And the other three elements are metric. Oftentimes when we speak about, oh, let's improve our health, but then there is no metric attached. There is no measurement. How we gonna track the improvement? So metric comes into the game, and then what the metric shows today, what's the value on it? And then what's the value expected in the future? And that's the tool which I call metric, currently in the transformation framework. That's one that came into this paper. The second one, that was the origin of circles. That's tool number 4 in the transformation framework. Tool number 4, circles, which distinguishes green people that currently already live in their well-being and they actively take care of their health and activities and their minds. And then red people who are careless about their health and well-being for themselves and for others. And then the January 1st circle, the yellow people who are saying they are willing to live better and they are considering well-being to be an essential part of their lives, but in reality, their behaviors are not really evidencing progress towards their well-being. So that was the second tool in this paper that came out from my work at MIT. And the third one, to conclude, was about technology design. And the tool from the transformation framework is tool number 5. It's called architecture, the architecture explaining, and pretty much simply, but very importantly, then the future behavioral design interventions will predominantly be using data input, real-time data feedback about, and we speak about cities, about urban behaviors, people behaving in cities. Data is the first layer in the architecture, and that's essential one because that gives us a sense what's happening right now. And the next is intelligence. And when we look back again, the conversation about smart cities, it was all about making smarter decisions based on data. But the problem was that people were considering this smart cities kind of achievement when the data is arriving in a nicely visually appealing ways on the table for at least 5 to 10 people making decisions. And then I was thinking, that's not really what makes significant transformations. It shouldn't stop there. So the intelligence layer is to extract from the raw data the circles. So how many green people towards that behavior we have in the city, how many red and how many yellow. So that's the intelligence layer above the data. And the third layer that I put on top of that architecture beyond smart cities, I said, instead of just people, experts making decisions based on the data, why don't we put this data, instant feedback projections to the actual participants in the urban life, to the people? Why don't we use screens in cities? Why don't we use lights, street lights, all other technologies that are already penetrating our urban spaces? Why don't we use those to reflect how many people ride bikes on that particular street? And we have the bike counters already. But then instead of just counting on a one street, why don't we place several counters in the different neighborhoods and then possibly to aggregate the data and then project a perspective how that bike ridership increases over time in the different neighborhoods. And the whole idea, the project that we worked on at MIT was called Persuasive Urban Mobility. I would now call it Transforming Urban Mobility. And the idea was how to empower societies to choose more eco-friendly and more active ways of moving around. And therefore, the idea was how we can use that bike ridership data to visualize and to give it back to the community in transforming ways. And what study that we implemented based on this idea, we downscaled from the neighborhoods to the organizations. And so we had one study involving 14 companies, real employees commuting to work and back. And we looked how many of them ride bikes. And for 6 weeks, 240 people, employees, rode 30,000 miles to the work and back. And then not only they were able to see the ranking of the companies And the rankings were based on how many people from the particular company, percentage-wise, were riding bikes, how many miles per rider every company made on average, the total number of miles per company, and also the enthusiasm, which means the increase in the first ranking, which is if there was an increase in percentage of how many employees rode a bike to work. And not only people were able to see on their usual technology in their hands, but we also asked in companies to put it on one of their TVs. So there are TVs in the companies, sometimes in kitchens, sometimes somewhere else, and they usually show either TV or news or something else. And so we asked for one of these TVs, please put this biking tourney on it. And then what we were really getting as a feedback, people were standing next to these screens, seeing how the companies in a ranking swap places as people arrive to work by bikes. And these new miles are counted into the system. And that's kind of rearranges the ranking in real time. And then some of the people would have the conversation saying, oh, I just arrived with a bike. And you see, I added these miles to our company. And the other person just looks at the same screen and says, I ride by car, but actually I live 2 miles away. And actually I ride bike on the weekends. And there is this new bike lane connecting my home and work. And I could easily come by bike, but I just don't have this habit. But now, next day, because of this engaging system, reflecting the bike ridership, was provoking people to change their minds and reconsider alternative ways of mobility. And if they don't have any other obstacle except habit, now the system provoked people to change. And actually, over time, they would realize, oh, it's not that bad. And that would make these people transform.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful vision, and it sounds like the experiment was a success, right? It validated the hypothesis that if you provide this kind of information, it actually will lead to significant behavioral change, right?
So within these 6 weeks, we don't expect, and we didn't expect people to really transform, because that's a big decision, how we commute. And of course, consciously people are aware of these choices and they have made decision earlier and they stick with the decision they've made. These systems, when they are placed around people, they are triggering to reconsider alternatives and actually re-question their previous decision. And the longer these systems are visible, the more borderline people between yellow and green, on the borderline, still yellow, not green, but there is a one step away. These people are the first candidates to cross the border and jump over the fence and become green. And that again enables this eternal engine, which kind of pulls socially yellow people into the green. And therefore, once such a system is implemented and left there for sustaining time, which means again, not to kind of do the experiment, but just part of your life, then that would naturally create a wave of transformation. So within our study, within the 6 weeks, we saw the potential of the system. And we proposed, to be frank, we proposed to the companies, why don't we continue? And that was mid-November. So we started in October, and it was mid-November, and it was Boston. It's Massachusetts.
Winter has been the silent enemy of mobility enhancements for a while.
And I don't say that there are no bike riders in the winter.
Yeah.
Here is one.
Yeah.
So I was 3 winters in Boston, and I was riding all 3 winters, except the blizzard days. Of course, when the blizzard comes, everything stops, and people who have lived there, they know it.
Yeah.
So therefore, I of course proposed, and we proposed to the companies, why don't we continue, just for many good reasons, to see how people would react, to see how people would adapt or not adapt, how also different conditions, different circumstances would influence their decisions. But reality was similar to many other research-oriented studies, where perception of people, when they see the scientists, for some reason, for historic reason, they consider that this is temporary. So they come in, they do the measurements, they do certain intervention that they have designed, and then they wait that this is going to be over. And I think that's one fundamental bias towards science, that science is a temporary investigation. And I would like to put my work in a different perspective. I would like to people see my work constantly as a sustainable change and transformation. So it's this sustainable science. It's not about temporary science. Science pushes the frontier of knowledge in a certain area forward. And there is no finite point for the most of the science, especially if you look to our human beings and our complexity and sophistication. So therefore, unfortunately, our study stopped in mid-November, but it's very easy to replicate. And there were even some ongoing discussions to do that. And even the software is available. So it's available from the Austrian Institute of Technology. And if people are willing to get that study replicated, there are people right there that could be asked for that. And why not? Let's just do it in more cities and with more companies.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? And this is this for me is actually the meaty part of the question, which is, I mean, this sounds like this is also tied into this initial discussion we had about how about you are this weird hybrid of a consultant and a scientist, precisely because I think of that framing problem, right? Because if you're a scientist, people will trust you and they'll be willing to take a risk and do this short-term experiment, but it's almost because they think of it as a short-term thing I'm doing for the good of science, not actually because they've already committed to a journey of transformation. Almost as a, and I wonder if sometimes they almost use it as a vaccine. I am doing something good for science, like I am going to work out, therefore I can eat that tub of ice cream later tonight, is because I can make myself feel like I am doing something good for me without actually doing the thing that is actually good for me.
You know how we named this phenomena? And actually we collected under one of our papers, also from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and we collaborated with Brian Kugelman from Canada. And we two scientists, we investigated persuasive backfires. And that was one of the backfires when people, it was called self-licensing. And it was out of the earlier study where people were self-licensing to litter when they have done a donation just before some time. So, which means if they have done an act of charity and they've given money or something, then they were more likely to just, I don't know, throw paper from your ice cream on the street, or they wouldn't feel as much guilt for doing that. So that's self-licensing. And you brought up a very great point. It's if people predisposition towards science as a temporary thing, as they are doing like a charity or an investment into the scientific discovery, but they are not taking it as a real thing that would stay and scientifically inform the reality and products and services, but just like as a temporary thing. Oh, I'm just going to do it because that makes me feel good, and it's not going to work anyway.
Yeah, but that I've not heard the word self-licensing, but that's a great, I mean, I think we haven't really talked about this much before, right? The thing where I got into this particular strand was through micromobility and this idea of microurbanism, which is the idea of rethinking cities around the idea of digital, around rebuilding our concept of cities around the idea of digital democracy. The idea is that if we actually have a financial capitalist imperative to quantify our cities, could we, what's the opposite of subvert? Supervert that to, I guess supervene maybe is actually a word, that to help cities take an honest look at themselves and actually start acting in ways that promote the well-being of everyone. And I think part of the problem is, I think the reason that is hard is precisely this effect, is that people latch onto a piece of it that makes them feel good. And then that gives them the license to ignore the parts that do not make them feel good. And then we end up in these fragmented echo chambers where people are only looking at the data that makes them feel good and feeling virtuous relative to their peers for how green they are, and totally oblivious to the places where they are red.
That's
Wasn't meant.
really
I didn't mean for this to
interesting.
be a commentary on the state of society post-COVID, but it does kind of fit.
Right. It is. And that really asks for more exploration. What asks for more exploration is to see the degree of self-licensing in human beings. So where is this anywhere balancing between the green behaviors, the positive, well-being, sustainable, flourishing, charity, doing good, and then the people, when they make maybe unhealthy choices for themselves or unfriendly choices for the society or unsustainable choices for the planet. And then, of course, people would fall into the yellow category as well, where they are saying, oh, this is really bad to be done, but they still cannot get over it. So they kind of repeat things that they believe are not the best choices, but they still cannot get out of that habitual loop. And the question is, would be interesting to see how people would internally, from their decision making, the decisions would be distributed across these three circles. So it's not like I usually look at the communities and societies and I try to seek for these people to fall into one of the three, and how possibly even the organizational context. If the company has one department with 20 people, it's quite easy. So you kind of observe them for some time and you see, okay, within this department, and if it's a the particular behavior of arriving on time to work, then we have 7 green, we have 10 yellow, and then we have 3 red. And what's the difference is yellow say, oh, arriving to work on time, it's very important because it's about efficiency, it's about discipline, it's about respect to the colleagues, it's about getting work done, and many others. Red people would say arriving to work on time, it's pointless because work is all the time, and it doesn't matter if I work at home and then I work at my office, and then the results won't change. So they would say no to the discipline arriving at time. And then yellow people, which in this case would be 10, they would say, it's great, definitely for everyone. It would be best to be on time, but for whatever reasons, they usually arrive late.
Yeah. So I think it's it gets back to this issue of the quantified self. The interesting thing for me is, I think I may have mentioned this idea of the fractal self, and that who do I think I am? And ideally, we'd start from an understanding of what it means to be healthy and then define ourselves relative to that. But in practice, I have noticed most people, most of the time, including myself, start with who I am, and I have a slightly idealized version of myself that I use as the standard. And then I judge others relative to that. And that is really good at getting this level of delta. And then it's sort of, but using that slightly idealized version of myself then becomes the thing that ends up ignoring the negative consequences. I think, to me as an Indian, this idea of self and community is almost a false distinction, right? Because I can see myself as, you know, when I'm in my more Indian mindset, I'm part of a community more than I'm an individual. And the tendency to, I think it's called the true Irishman fallacy. Well, you know, like my tribe, we are virtuous. And if we're not virtuous, well, that's just because one member of my tribe is not really being consistent. And that mind game that we play with ourselves is, I think, why it's hard to like I think about these kind of like, especially now, right? If we could have a quantified community where we're actually measuring being in real time, oh my God. I mean, we're kind of moving towards that semi-unintentionally with contact tracing and things like that. And it's easy to imagine us getting to places where at least companies really are trying to create quantified wellness at scale. I mean, I can imagine Amazon doing that to their employees quite easily. And I can even imagine that being a good thing up to a point. And I think there are people who could imagine that being a really, really bad thing, who would want to fight against that for bad reasons, and those people actually being right. And if we could, so I guess maybe I'll leave you with that challenge. Is like, I think you've got an amazing vision here. Is there a way to tell that story that it actually would be good at scale if everyone believed it? Because it actually addresses all the backfires that would make people legitimately want to oppose it.
Here is the truth. We human beings are becoming aware when we look into a mirror. And that's how it works. Physically, when we come to a mirror, we see how do we look, our hair, our beard, everything. And all of this quantified self and quantified communities idea is just as a mirror. So for quantified self is your small mirror in your pocket, and quantified self is the societal mirror. And what it reflects, everything. It reflects our good intentions, getting healthier, living in a state of well-being, flourish, making more sustainable choices towards our planet. At the same time, it reflects all the rest, all our demons, all our dark intentions, all our possible taste of laziness or neglectance, or sometimes all other spectrum that belongs to the human nature historically. And that is exactly why so many people oftentimes are sensitive, because they know mirrors gonna show everything. So they try to not let the mirrors be placed around them. And that's the only reason.
And it depends enormously on who is holding up the mirror.
As well. So people in their creativity, they come up with these mind games internally, and they say, well, yes, this is a great idea. Let's do this bike counting on the streets. But let's not put it on my street.
Yes, I think this is the thing about scientists, is that when a scientist shows you a mirror, you should assume it is a one-way glass. And they can see you and you can't see them. So maybe as a metaphor, you almost need the two-way mirror for people to actually trust it.
That's an interesting way to see that. I never thought. Thank you for bringing this up. But so far, my understanding was that there is the mirror where everyone stands on the same side, including scientists.
Right, that's what I would call the two-way mirror, right? But that is the thing that every organization I've ever worked with appears to be explicitly designed to avoid. every organization I've ever been a part of has a one-way mirror where the people at the top want to see everything happening below them and never want to be exposed to that same level of scrutiny.
That's great observation and a great summary. Yes. And what would you say? You would say, isn't that contributing to a performance in the company? Is it?
and the sad fact I've discovered, especially since leaving Apple, that most people, most of the time, would rather fail than be embarrassed. And they will deliberately sabotage truth and success and even themselves rather than risk looking bad.
I think this idea and perspective really is a nice intro for our next session, I guess. So okay. I think that's such a vast space to discuss, and I really love that. I really love that. It comes down to the very basic human nature, and then performance, which is the key thing for the organizations. And if none of the other people are daring to discuss it like we do, so I'm inviting you to our next episode, discussing this one-sided mirror phenomena in organizations and whether that helps or that inhibits the hyper performance in the organizations and corporations globally.
All right, and the homework assignment is to watch Ralph Wrecks the Internet, about where he actually confronts the man in the mirror.
All right. So I would suggest maybe next Thursday.
A week from in 2 days, or in a week and 2 days?
In a week and 2 days.
Sounds perfect. Thank you.
All right, then.
Talk to you then.
All right. This was great. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yes. Bye.